It was the summer of 1944. The war in Europe still raged with unimaginable fury. Across the Atlantic, thousands of captured German soldiers were being shipped to the United States. Far from the battlefields of Normandy, the ruins of Berlin, and the ashes of their homeland. Many expected harsh punishment, cold camps, or humiliation at the hands of their captors. But what they found was something entirely different. In the heart of the American Midwest, under the blazing July sun, rows of German prisoners of war labored in the fields, helping with the harvest to replace the young American men who were still fighting overseas. Sweat dripped down their faces, their uniforms dusty and worn. The air shimmered with heat until a sound broke the monotony, the rattle of an approaching truck, and then laughter. American guards began unloading something unexpected. Large metal tubs packed with ice and small white containers, ice cream. The German prisoners stared in disbelief as the guards waved them over. Some hesitated, unsure if this was a cruel joke. Others accepted cautiously, eyes darting in confusion. But as the first spoonfuls melted on their tongues, something in the air shifted. For the first time in years, many of these young men, once enemies on the battlefield, experienced a fleeting moment of kindness and humanity. This simple act, American soldiers sharing ice cream with their captives, became one of countless quiet moments that challenged the boundaries of war. It was a gesture that said, even here, even now, we can still be human. After the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, the tide of World War II began to shift decisively. German forces, overwhelmed by superior numbers, air power, and resources, surrendered in the tens of thousands. For the Allied command, this sudden influx of captured soldiers created a new and unexpected challenge. What to do with them? Europe was already bursting with prisoner of war camps, many under constant threat from air raids or food shortages. The solution, at least for the Americans, lay far across the Atlantic. Between 1943 and 1945, over 400,000 German prisoners of war were transported to the United States, a staggering operation that stretched across the ocean in tightly guarded troop ships. Most of the prisoners were stunned the moment they disembarked. They had been told by Nazi propaganda that America was a land of chaos, crime, and cruelty, that they would be beaten, starved, or executed upon capture. Instead, they found something entirely different. The first sight of the American coastline filled many with disbelief. The ports were calm, the towns untouched by bombing, the people going about their daily lives. For men who had survived the carnage of the Eastern Front or the firestorms of Hamburg, America felt almost unreal, a world still intact. From the docks, trains carried them deep into the heartland. Texas, Oklahoma, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska. The journey itself was a revelation. Through the barred windows of their railcars, they saw endless fields, small towns, school children waving at the passing train. The guards, mostly young men barely older than the prisoners themselves, were often relaxed, even friendly. Some offered cigarettes. Others, curious, tried speaking a few words of broken German. The camps were not what they expected either. Built to comply with the Geneva Convention, they were organized with military precision. Rows of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. But inside there was order, food, and even a sense of routine. Prisoners received regular meals, often better than what German civilians were getting back home. They could write letters, attend church, or even read books provided by the Red Cross. Some camps offered English lessons and workshops. Others allowed orchestras, theater groups, and soccer tournaments. Many German soldiers couldn't comprehend this treatment. For years, Nazi propaganda had dehumanized their enemies, portraying Americans as corrupt and barbaric. Yet here they were, offered coffee in the mornings, soap to wash with, and medical care when sick. One prisoner later wrote in his diary, "I felt confusion more than anything. I could not understand how a nation we were told to hate could treat us with such fairness." The American government had strategic reasons for this approach. Treating prisoners humanely ensured that American soldiers captured overseas would receive similar treatment, at least in theory. But beyond the politics and military logic, There was also a sense of decency among many guards and local civilians. In small Midwestern towns, the presence of these captured Germans became part of everyday life. They worked the fields, repaired roads, and helped harvest crops during labor shortages. Farmers often spoke with them, discovering that their supposed enemies were ordinary young men, some barely out of their teens, who missed their homes and families just as much as any American boy fighting in Europe. For the German prisoners of war, this realization was profound. The journey to America had stripped them of their uniforms, their insignia, their identity as soldiers of Hitler's army. But in exchange, they were confronted with something unexpected: humanity from those they had been taught to destroy. It was the first step in a transformation that would unfold in countless small acts of compassion, including one unforgettable day when ice cream, not bullets, bridged the divide between enemies. Life inside the American prisoner of war camps was unlike anything most German soldiers had imagined when they were captured. After the chaos and brutality of the front lines, the camps felt strangely calm, almost peaceful. For many of these young men, some barely 20 years old, it was the first time in years they could sleep through the night without the sound of artillery or the fear of an air raid. Yet that peace came with a haunting awareness. They were prisoners in a land they had once been told was their enemy. The camps themselves were laid out with military precision. Wooden barracks were arranged in neat rows, surrounded by barbed wire fences and guarded towers. Each camp was a self-contained community, complete with kitchens, infirmaries, recreation areas, and even small chapels. Daily life followed a predictable rhythm: morning roll call, work assignments, meals, and lights out. The structure gave the men a sense of order, something that contrasted sharply with the chaos of battle they had left behind. Work became central to their days. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be required to perform non-military labor. In the United States, this meant replacing the millions of American workers who were away fighting overseas. German prisoners harvested crops, chopped lumber, built roads, and worked in canneries or on farms. They were paid a small wage, usually 80 cents a day in camp currency, which they could use at the camp canteen to buy cigarettes, soap, or writing materials. What surprised many prisoners most was the fairness of their treatment. They were given 3 meals a day, often consisting of bread, potatoes, vegetables, and meat, and medical care when needed. The guards enforced discipline, but cruelty was rare. Most of the Americans overseeing the camps were National Guard units or older reservists, men who had families of their own and little taste for vengeance. To them, the prisoners were not monsters, just soldiers who had fought on the other side. Inside the fences, life began to develop its own strange normalcy. The prisoners organized choirs, soccer leagues, and even theater performances. Some camps printed newsletters or held art exhibitions displaying paintings and carvings made from scraps of wood. Others offered educational programs run by local universities or the YMCA, where prisoners could study English, mathematics, or even political philosophy. Many took these opportunities seriously, aware that one day they would return to a shattered Germany that would need rebuilding. Letters from home were a lifeline. Through the Red Cross, prisoners could write to their families, though mail often took months to arrive. Some letters carried devastating news: parents killed in bombings, towns destroyed, loved ones missing. Others brought moments of hope. One prisoner later recalled receiving a letter from his mother saying, "At least you are safe where you are. Here we have forgotten what peace feels like." Despite the order and relative comfort, not all was easy. There was a deep sense of humiliation that lingered in the hearts of many prisoners. They had been soldiers of what they were told was the most powerful army in the world. Now they worked under guard in foreign fields. Some wrestled with guilt over what their country had done. Others clung to pride or denial. Tensions occasionally flared, particularly between die-hard Nazis and those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler's promises. Camp authorities often had to separate political hardliners from moderate or anti-Nazi prisoners to prevent violence. Yet even with those divisions, there was a quiet understanding that life in these camps was better than what awaited them elsewhere. Prisoners who had fought on the Eastern Front knew that Soviet captivity meant near certain death. In America, they were treated as men, and that realization slowly began to reshape their understanding of the war. Some began to question the beliefs they had been raised on. Others simply appreciated the small mercies, a warm meal, a conversation with a guard, or a soccer match under the open sky. For these German prisoners of war, life in America was a paradox. They were captives yet free from the horrors of the front. They were far from home, yet closer to humanity than they had been in years. And as the months passed, the boundaries between enemy and man began to blur, setting the stage for moments of kindness and compassion that would stay with them long after the war had ended. The summer of 1944 was one of the hottest on record in the American Midwest. For the German prisoners of war working in the fields, the heat was relentless. Day after day, under a sun that seemed to hang motionless in the cloudless sky, they bent over rows of corn and wheat, their sweat-soaked shirts clinging to their backs. The air shimmered with heat waves, and every breath felt thick with dust. Many of these men had been soldiers only months before, tank crewmen, infantry, Luftwaffe mechanics, now reduced to farm laborers in a foreign land. Yet as grueling as the work was, there was something strangely peaceful about it. The crack of thunder was replaced by the hum of cicadas, the scream of artillery by the rustle of wind through tall grass. In one camp, located in rural Kansas, the conditions were particularly harsh. Temperatures reached well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the prisoners toiled from sunrise to late afternoon, harvesting grain for local farmers. The guards, mostly young American soldiers, many from nearby towns, stood watch with rolled-up sleeves and sweat dripping from beneath their helmets. Despite the difference in uniforms, the two groups shared the same exhaustion. The Americans knew the prisoners weren't their real enemies. They were farmhands doing their part to keep the home front running, while the war still raged across the ocean. As the days grew hotter, morale among the German prisoners began to wane. They drank warm water from canteens, wiped dust from their eyes, and trudged back to camp in silence each evening. The guards noticed. A few of them, moved by the sheer misery of the heat, decided to do something about it. One sergeant, a farmer's son himself, suggested they use their own pay to bring in a small treat for everyone. It was an idea born from empathy more than duty, an impulse to offer a simple comfort in a world where comfort was rare. A few days later, a truck rolled into the camp. Its engine sputtered as it bounced over the dirt road, and as it drew closer, the men saw the guards laughing and calling out to one another. In the back of the truck were several large metal tubs packed with ice and small paper containers. The prisoners watched, puzzled. The guards shouted for them to line up. Then came the surprise. "Ice cream!" one of the Americans called out, handing over the first container. At first, the Germans hesitated. They had heard of ice cream, a luxury, something for children or peacetime. Now in the middle of a war, under guard and behind wire, they were being offered it by the very men they had once fought against. Slowly, uncertainly, they accepted. The first spoons lifted to their mouths were followed by silence. Then murmurs, smiles, laughter. For a moment, the heat didn't matter. The guards joked with the prisoners, sharing the same treat under the same blazing sun. The ice cream melted quickly in the heat, but the memory of that moment did not. It was a fleeting act of kindness, one that transcended the boundaries of uniforms and nations. The German prisoners, many of whom had lost faith in the idea of compassion during the long years of war, were left stunned. One later described it in a letter. "It was as if we were human again. Not enemies, not soldiers, just men tasting something sweet on a hot day." For the Americans, it was equally profound. They saw in the faces of their prisoners not the enemy they had been trained to hate, but reflections of themselves, tired, homesick, and young. The ice cream, so ordinary in peacetime America, became a symbol of something extraordinary in wartime. A moment when humanity overcame hostility. If only for an afternoon. When the guards began handing out the ice cream, time seemed to stop. For a moment, neither side knew how to react. The German prisoners of war stood silently in the scorching Kansas heat, their hands hesitating as the paper cups were passed to them. Some glanced at the guard suspiciously, uncertain if this was a test, a trick, or perhaps an insult in disguise. For years they had been taught that Americans were ruthless and cruel, that capture meant humiliation or death. Yet here they were, being offered something cold, sweet, and utterly unexpected: ice cream in the middle of a war. The first few prisoners took their portions hesitantly. A guard motioned for them to eat. One German, his face gaunt from months of strain, dipped his spoon and tasted it. His eyes widened. Then, slowly, a smile broke across his face. A small, disbelieving grin that seemed to ripple outward through the ranks of prisoners. Others followed, murmuring in surprise at the flavor and the chill. For men who had lived through firestorms and famine, the cool taste of vanilla on the tongue was almost unreal. The American guards laughed softly as they watched. They weren't trying to make a grand statement. To them, it was simply a humane gesture, something any decent person would do on a hot day. But to the prisoners, it meant something far deeper. The moment became a quiet rebellion against the hatred that had defined their world. Beneath the sun and the barbed wire, the idea of enemy began to lose its meaning. Some prisoners later recalled that scene with a clarity sharper than any battle. One remembered how the guards joked among themselves, teasing each other about who could eat faster before the ice cream melted. Another wrote that for the first time since his capture, he felt almost free. Free not in body but in spirit, because someone had treated him as a human being rather than a symbol of an ideology. The ice cream itself was secondary. What lingered was the feeling that, even in the midst of war, compassion had not been extinguished. For the Americans, too, the experience left an impression. Most of the guards were not hardened soldiers. They were farm boys, factory workers, or students who had been called to service. Standing across from these German prisoners, many realized how similar they all were. Young men caught in a conflict far larger than themselves. The simple act of sharing a treat bridged that unspoken divide. One guard later told his grandson, "You could see it in their eyes. They weren't monsters. They were just tired men, same as us." As the prisoners finished, the guards gathered the empty cups and tossed them into the back of the truck. The heat returned, the work resumed, and the war continued thousands of miles away. But something subtle had changed in that camp. There was a gentler tone in the way the men spoke to each other, a newfound respect that defied the labels of captor and captive. The prisoners still wore their German uniforms, and the guards still carried their rifles. But for one brief afternoon, the world had become simpler. In that fleeting gesture, a scoop of ice cream offered to the enemy, lay the essence of humanity amid the chaos of war. It was a reminder that kindness could exist even where it seemed impossible, and that the smallest acts often leave the deepest marks. Years later, when these men looked back on their time in captivity, it wasn't the fences or the labor they remembered most. It was the day the Americans gave them ice cream under a burning summer sun, and for the first time, they tasted peace. In the days that followed the ice cream incident, the camp felt subtly transformed. Something intangible had shifted between the American guards and the German prisoners of war. The tension that once filled the air, that quiet, unspoken wall of mistrust, began to soften. The prisoners, who had once kept their distance, started greeting the guards in halting English. A few even attempted humor, mimicking the guards' accents or joking about the unbearable heat. The Americans, surprised but amused, responded in kind. What had once been two opposing sides divided by barbed wire began in small but meaningful ways to resemble neighbors sharing the same fate under the same blazing sky. For the prisoners, the gesture of ice cream carried far more weight than the Americans realized. It wasn't just about the sweet taste on a hot day. It was about dignity. It was proof that the men guarding them did not see them as beasts or criminals, but as fellow human beings. Some prisoners later wrote home about the experience, their words tinged with disbelief. One described it as the first time I felt warmth from an American. Another wrote, "They did not have to do it. They could have ignored us, but instead they shared something simple and kind." It made me think about what we were told, and what was true. The guards themselves were not immune to the emotional impact of that afternoon. Many had grown up on farms or in small Midwestern towns, raised with a sense of decency and fairness that went deeper than politics. They had been told the Germans were enemies, the face of tyranny, the soldiers of Hitler. But when they stood face to face with those weary, sunburned men eating ice cream like children, it became harder to see them through the lens of propaganda. Some guards later admitted that it was the first time they questioned what it really meant to be at war. One sergeant reportedly told a fellow soldier, "If you can share ice cream with a man, it's hard to imagine shooting at him." Of course, not everyone approved. There were officers who believed such gestures were too lenient, that war demanded discipline and distance. But for those who had been there that day, it was clear that the act had changed something profound. The guards noticed fewer disciplinary issues, less tension and more cooperation from the prisoners. It was as if that one act of kindness had dissolved an invisible barrier. Beyond the camp, local townspeople began to hear about what had happened. Word spread quietly through the community, whispers of those Germans who had been given ice cream by their guards. Some locals were uneasy, believing the prisoners didn't deserve kindness. Others, however, saw it differently. One farmer's wife reportedly said, "If our boys are over there, wouldn't we want someone to show them the same mercy?" Her words captured the sentiment that lingered in many hearts, that compassion, even toward an enemy, was a reflection of one's own humanity. Years later, when former prisoners were interviewed about their time in America, the ice cream story resurfaced again and again. It had become a kind of legend among them, a story they told not because of the ice cream itself, but because of what it represented. For men who had come from a regime built on hate and fear, this small spontaneous moment of generosity revealed something extraordinary about their captors. Gad hinted at a world that could exist after the war, a world built not on revenge but on understanding. For both sides, that day was unforgettable. It wasn't written in military records or reported in newspapers, yet it carried more meaning than any official order. It reminded everyone involved that war may divide nations, but it cannot completely erase the shared humanity that lies beneath the uniforms. In the simple exchange of ice cream on a sweltering afternoon, the Germans and Americans found common ground, not as enemies but as men who, despite everything, still had the capacity to care. When the war finally ended in 1945, the German prisoners of war began their long journeys home. The camps that had once been filled with the sounds of marching boots, laughter, and work details grew quiet as transport trains carried the men back toward a shattered Europe. Many of the prisoners left with mixed emotions, relief to be free but also a strange sense of loss. Life in captivity had been structured and predictable, a rare island of safety in a world torn apart by chaos. Returning home meant stepping into a country they no longer recognized. Cities lay in ruins, families were displaced, and hunger stalked the streets of post-war Germany. Yet, among the memories they carried with them, one stood out vividly, that single act of kindness on a scorching American summer day when their guards had handed them ice cream. For many, that moment became more than a fleeting gesture. It became a symbol of everything they had learned during their years of captivity. The experience of being treated with dignity and fairness by the Americans profoundly changed their understanding of the world. Some who had been devoted followers of Nazi ideology returned home questioning everything they had believed. They had seen a different kind of strength, not the brutal power of conquest, but the quiet strength of compassion. One former prisoner later wrote, "The Americans defeated us with humanity. That is something no army can prepare for." In the years that followed, countless former prisoners shared stories of their time in the United States. Some went on to become teachers, farmers, or craftsmen who carried with them a lasting appreciation for democracy and fairness. A few even returned to America after the war, seeking the very land that had once held them captive. They found work, built families, and became citizens of the country that had shown them mercy. Oral histories collected decades later reveal how deeply those experiences resonated. One man recalled, "They gave us more than food and shelter. They gave us back the belief that decency still existed in the world." Historians now recognize these prisoner of war camps as an often overlooked chapter in World War II history. A story not of battles, but of humanity. The United States' adherence to the Geneva Convention, even in the midst of total war, demonstrated a moral commitment that contrasted sharply with the atrocities unfolding elsewhere. While not every camp was perfect and not every guard was kind, the overall treatment of German prisoners in America became an example of restraint and honor. The ice cream story, small as it was, encapsulated the spirit of that approach. It showed that gestures of goodwill could ripple across generations, transforming perceptions and healing wounds. For the Germans who experienced it, that day was a reminder that kindness could emerge from even the darkest chapters of history. For the Americans, it reinforced the idea that victory was not just measured by battles won, but by the values preserved along the way. Decades later, when survivors from both sides met again, sometimes through veterans' reunions or historical projects, they often spoke not of violence or hatred, but of that fragile thread of humanity that had endured through the war. One former guard, now an elderly man, said during an interview, "We thought we were just doing something small. But maybe that's what makes it matter. The small things are what last." In the grand scale of World War II, a few tubs of ice cream might seem insignificant. But for those who lived it, that day in the sun became a timeless reminder that even amid the cruelty of war, compassion can melt the hardest divisions. It was proof that in the face of destruction, the simplest acts of decency could become the most enduring victories of all.